Welcome to Voluble Minds, reflections on and abbreviated readings of famous philosophical dialogues. I'm Colin Wulff, Assistant Director of Religious Education at the Fourth Universalist Society in New York City. If you would like to skip the introductory segment on today's philosopher and dialogue and go straight to the reading, the timestamp posted in the video description will help you to do that. Thank you for joining us. Our next philosopher will be the French theologian Nicolas Malebranche, who lived from 1638 to 1715. He'd catch the last third of the 30 Years' War, in which, to put it very simply, Catholic and Protestant tensions we've been observing in past units really explode. Malebranche was of the Cartesian tradition, of the divisible dualistic categories of soul and body, and of examining human perception as a function of divine volition and intervention. Malebranche offered some personal flourishes, though. Believing that God was the basis of all events and reality, he developed a theory called occasionalism that reconciled our experience of free will with the continuous involvement of God's hand in everything we experience. Continuous creation was a Cartesian idea that every new moment of worldly experience is a moment of active maintenance or adjustment by God, no less of an exertion than the original Genesis. In Malebranche's occasionalist grace note, we don't really influence other objects around us, or indeed even our own bodies. Rather, our will to effect change and the motions we go through with respect to our environment offer occasions for God to allow our seeming influence and causes to manifest, though even God's intervention is bound by adherence to some fundamental and unalterable laws. God cannot, for instance, make 2 and 2 equal to 5. If you stuck around for the post-discussion in Boethius' section, Constellation of Philosophy, you might recall that this was also a tenet of the Molinist interpretation of reconciling free will with God's complete knowledge. Occasionalism may seem a somewhat convoluted notion, and it is. I'll try to offer some examples to prepare you for the more technical exposition of it in dialogue. Let's say the clock strikes 5 and you decide to punch out of work. An observer seeing you punch out every day at 5 might think the clock indicating 5 made you punch out, but it didn't literally cause you to punch out. You could have stayed for some overtime if you wanted. You just had a habitual and fatigue-related compulsion to punch out. The clock striking 5 was then the occasion of your punching out. And so even though the two regularly occur in direct sequence, there isn't a necessary causal relationship. This is how Malebranche described God's relationship to all of our decisions, to all worldly happenings, in fact. But to extend our example by way of God, our will would be the clock to which God adjusts his movements of us in correspondence with our will. Our will, or any natural event that seems to prompt change in an object or its environment, is the occasion of God's intervention. But it isn't like God is waiting for our will to grant him permission for enacting it. God's omniscient. So it is more like God is helping to organize pieces already existent in his foreknowledge, or if we remember Augustine via Boethius, his eternal present. Another way to think of occasionalism is to imagine a video game environment in which the character you control is capable of cutting a log with an axe. The in-game physics, as shown, are an illusion. I mean, there's software bound up in hardware and superimposition of pixels thanks to a team of designers, developers, and programmers, so there are efficient and material electric causes, but there is no metal cutting wood, and thus the polygons comprising the axe are not actually the physical cause of the polygons comprising the wood to be sliced in the way a material stump would be cleaved if a sharp enough wedge, like an axe blade, were applied to it. Rather, the computer coding recognizes the action performed as constituting an occasion for the corresponding visible effect, which resembles to the player and is, for all purposes within the game world, an axe cutting a stump. This is more or less how Malebranche views God as having a continuous hand in all events and relationships and our perceptions of them. But whereas in a video game, close enough observation will always reveal the signs of its unreality, of its repletion with unnecessary relationships, the world of our existence, being divinely created, is not going to betray itself in that way, and correspondences, insofar as they are perceptible, will always be consistent and elegant. So for Malebranche, it is more what we are incapable of perceiving that leads us to reason our way to the necessity for God. We can track seeming causes for quite a while, but will eventually encounter, according to him, not so much a crack in the design that points to God's handiwork, but rather a dead end beyond which our senses can no further penetrate, which to Malebranche is a negative but infinite space only God is adequate to fill. Our selection from Malebranche will be his dialogues on metaphysics and religion. In these dialogues, Theodore is the mouthpiece of Malebranche, and we will confine our selections for simplicity's sake only to his conversations with one Aristes and leave out Theotimus, the third participant. Something we will only see a hint of in our selection, but which is worth noting, is Malebranche's commitment to scientific inquiry. His theological assumptions got in the way of his ability to effectively progress on many of the questions he posed, but he did not see natural philosophy and theology as being necessarily contradictory, which didn't always help him, well intentioned as this was. When he failed to reconcile the two, he had what can come off as a rather defeatist recourse to faith and to declarations of his own mortal ignorance. Even scientists must recognize their own ignorance to frame further inquiry, of course, but if they overextended this humility into a cessation of their efforts, our ignorance would ever statically reign. Malebranche here also offers a minor add-on to Anselm of Canterbury's famous ontological argument from his 11th century work Proslogion. It is a fallacious but much adduced rationale for the necessity of God's existence. Anselm formulated in a brazen display of grammatical sleight of hand the following so-called proof. A state of existence is superior to a state of non-existence. God, being the most perfect being conceivable, would have to include existence among his attributes to actually be perfect and thus meet all his own descriptive criteria. If God didn't exist, God would be imperfect, and therefore not aptly called God, meaning the greatest conceivable being would be non existent, which is a contradiction because we are capable of conceiving of the existence of the greatest conceivable being as necessarily including existence. Therefore, God, by definition, necessarily exists. This, of course, begs multiple questions. First, it assumes the superiority of existing things to conceived things, when actually a less controversial, though still not provable claim would be we might prefer any given good thing which lends itself to existence to exist literally than not to exist or to merely exist abstractly. But it is a regular human practice to conceive of things which are superior or preferable to reality. Secondly, the argument depends on an assumption of God's existence for the proof thereof. It's entirely circular. Properly, this formula would only serve to identify God from among already existing beings, or it lays out a condition for verifying one narrow version of a God in the event of a God's possible existence, but it in no way compels God into existence on its own. Malebranche manages in his devotional acrobatics to offer an even faultier but still imaginative proof of God's existence by way of our conception of God. He focuses specifically on an idea that follows from Anselm's attempted proof that even our conception of God must be proof of God's existence, though Malebranche would emphasize God's infinitude in his formula. Questioning the accuracy and scope of our perceptions in discerning the world's objects and motions harkens back to the pre-Socratic philosopher Parmenides, who believed that existence was affirmed by its mere encounter and conception, that anything that could be thought of necessarily existed, and that we could not therefore so much as think of a thing that did not exist. It is was his catchphrase, and all motion and transformation were illusory. This, in contrast to Heraclitus, whose idea of constant flux is famously summed up in the aphorism, "You can't step in the same river twice." The sophist Gorgias, Plato named a dialogue after him, would satirize Parmenides' view of the inconceivability of the non existent in a poem, That Which Is Not, a catalogue of eminently imaginable, but just as non existent things. We'll hear more of them in our introduction to George Berkeley. Malebranche would not go as far as Parmenides in saying that a thing cannot be conceived of without existing, but he suggests we can only think of the non-existent if the non-existent object is a finite one and can thus be represented by a finite idea. But infinity and the very essence of being cannot be represented in part, and thus if we are acquainted with either notion at all, they must have existence, mainly in their synonymity with God. Here he ran into trouble, however, because he also confesses that we are incapable of being acquainted with the entirety of being or God's infinitude. In dialogue, his opposite, Aristes, questions Theodore, Malebranche's stand-in, on this contradiction, but Theodore does not manage a satisfactory answer. He insists that God is not represented to us finitely, while at the same time, our acquaintance with God's essential perfect simplicity is incomplete. But this is the definition of finitude. And the word God, as well as words like perfection, infinity, and beauty, are, of course, in themselves finite representations of ideas that cannot be universally conceived with any specificity or in their entirety unless we ourselves define the standard beforehand. Easy enough to do for subjective terms of which we are the initial authors anyway, though in the case of infinity, it would, of course, require us to just change the definition. But we know we can represent even infinity finitely in a moment. One example being the lemniscate, or horizontal figure eight symbol. It's a cinch. Malebranche might have saved himself some trouble had he acknowledged the finite representational quality of words. Berkeley, though borrowing plenty of theoretical trouble on his own, will tackle this to some satisfaction in Alciphron. But even with that problem of representing infinity removed, Malebranche's version of Anselm's proof would still be subject to the same formal fallacies. However, Malebranche's at least gestural efforts at investigating the natural world as much as possible before resorting to the God explanation, and his willingness to implicate the brain as a working organ as much as he does in a time when little was known of it, and the high premium he places on reason, and his fairly lucid and sincere explanations of essentially untenable positions are all perhaps things to be admired. Of course, the reason he celebrated is not just a general term for making sense of things, because it actually opposes itself to the testimony of the senses, or the empirical skepticism of Locke, Hume, and Berkeley, though this can be confusing because empiricism here doesn't necessarily mean a commitment to trusting wholly in the report of the senses, only an acknowledgement of the ways in which our knowledge, such as it is predicated on what our senses filter through to us. And that's a viewpoint from which occasionalism can't be entirely divorced. In addition to his struggle to unify an assumption of God's infinitude with any relationship to our earthly finitude, the nature of consciousness greatly confused Malebranche, as, to be fair, it does most of us. Of course, today we are able to trace much further the chain of causes leading to sensation and consciousness, which, of course, Malebranche wouldn't say were actual causes, but occasions for correspondence between things. Thus, though Malebranche manages to identify the brain as the seat of sensation, he believes in the necessity of bringing God into this dualism to bridge the gap from physical activity of the brain to a perceptible state of mind, which is really a state of soul, one that invariably corresponds to, but again, we'll keep hammering this central idea home, does not cause and is not caused by the body's motions. If you would like to hear more details on Nicolas Malebranche's relationship to other thinkers and ideas of his time, such as Gottfried Leibniz, who, among other things, developed calculus independently of Newton, and Malebranche's great rival, Antoine Arnauld, stick around for the post-dialogue discussion. Dialogues on Metaphysics and Religion was written in 1688, and we will be using Jonathan Bennett's edition from Early Modern Texts. You can find the link to that in the description, and this is not for commercial use. I'm joined today by my friend and an excellent actor, musician, and educator, Brian Ott. He's a great singer and guitarist, currently works as a CPR instructor, has a considerable fluency in theology in his own right, and gets a special thanks for lending us his voice while recovering from bronchitis. He will be reading Aristes to my Theodore. In this are selections from Malebranche's Dialogues on Metaphysics and Religion. Enjoy.
I think I see your meaning. You define God as he defined himself in speaking to Moses. I am what I am, Exodus 3:14. Intelligible extension is the idea or archetype of bodies, but our idea of being without restriction, or in a word, being, is the idea of God. It is what represents him to our minds as we see him in this life.
Very good. But note especially that God or the infinite isn't visible through an idea that represents it. There is no archetype or idea of the infinite, which is its own idea. This idea can be known, but it can't be made. What can be made are only created things, things of this or that kind, which are visible through ideas that represent them even before they are made. We could see a circle, a house, a sun, even if there were no such thing. All finite things can be seen in the infinite, which contains intelligible ideas of them. But the infinite can be seen only in itself, not by way of an idea that represents it, for nothing finite can represent the infinite. If we think of God, he must exist. I'll explain why in a moment. We can think about a being of this or that specific sort without its actually existing. Because it is finite, we can think about it through an idea that represents it, and with the help of that idea, we can see its essence without its existence. See the idea of it without it. But we can't see the essence of the infinite without its existence, the idea of being without being. For being is not represented by any idea. There is no archetype that contains all its intelligible reality. It is its own archetype, and it contains in itself the archetype of all beings. So you can see that the proposition, there is a God, is all by itself the clearest of all propositions affirming the existence of something, and that it is as certain even as I think, so I am. You can also see what God is because God and being and the infinite are one and the same thing.
Isn't there a contradiction in what you're telling me? If nothing finite can have enough reality to be able to represent the infinite, and it seems to me that's clearly right, mustn't we inevitably see God's substance in itself rather than seeing any of its properties or attributes, all of which are infinite?
I don't deny that we see God's substance in itself. We do see it in itself in the sense that our seeing of it doesn't involve something finite that represents it, but we don't see it in itself in the sense that we get right through to its simplicity and discover its many perfections. Since nothing finite can represent infinite reality, we agree on that. It is clear that if you see the infinite, you see it only in itself and not through any finite representation of it. And it's certain that you do see it. If you didn't, then in asking me whether God or an infinite being exists, you would be raising a ridiculous question involving a proposition, the terms of which you wouldn't understand. If you really had meditated on the principles that you say you are convinced of, you would see it for yourself. Answer me. Do you think that God feels the pain that we suffer?
Certainly not, for the feeling of pain makes one miserable.
Very well. But do you believe he knows it?
Yes, I believe he does, for he knows everything that happens to his creatures. God's knowledge has no limits, and he can know my pain without being either unhappy or imperfect.
Indeed, Aristes. God knows pain, pleasure, heat, and the rest, but doesn't feel these things. He knows pain because he knows what the state of the soul is, in which pain consists. He knows it because he alone causes it in us. I'll prove that to you later on. And of course, he knows what he does. In short, he knows it because his knowledge has no limits. He doesn't feel it because that would make him unhappy. Thus, to know pain is not to feel it.
That's true, but isn't feeling pain knowing it?
Certainly not, since God in no way feels it, yet he knows it perfectly. But let's not get held up by verbal difficulties. If you insist that feeling pain is knowing it, at least agree that it isn't knowing it clearly, isn't knowing it by light and evidentness. In short, isn't knowing its nature. And so, strictly speaking, it isn't knowing it. For you to feel pain is for you to be miserable without knowing what you are or what state of yourself is making you miserable. But to know something is to have a clear idea of its nature and to discover certain of its relations by light and evidentness. I know the parts of extension clearly because I can plainly see their relations. I urge you to get the knack of spotting the difference between knowing and feeling, between our clear ideas and our invariably obscure and confused sensations. And I maintain that just this distinction suffices for the discovery of an infinity of truths. You know music, don't you?
I know enough to charm away my bad temper and to banish my melancholy.
Good. Then tell me about the various sounds that you combine so rightly and pleasingly. What is an octave, a fifth, a fourth? Why is it that when two strings are tuned to the same note, we can't touch one without making the other move too? You have a very fine and delicate ear. Answer my questions by consulting that.
Well, I think you're making fun of me. What we have to consult to answer questions like that is not the senses, but reason.
That is true. We should consult the senses only about facts. Their power is very limited, but reason covers everything. Consult reason then, and take care not to muddle its replies with the testimony of your senses. Well then, what does it reply?
You're hurrying me too much. Still, I'll give you an answer. It seems to me that sound is a quality spread out in the air, a quality that can affect only the sense of hearing.
Do you call that consulting reason?
What do you want me to say to you? Come, here's an octave. Do, do. Here's a fifth. Do, re, mi, fa, so. Here's a fourth. Do, re, mi, fa.
You sing well, but how badly you reason. I think you're just enjoying yourself.
To be sure, Theodore. But for your other question, I reply that it is sympathy that makes the strings of the same pitch move one another. Haven't I got that right?
Let's be serious, Aristes. If you want me to enjoy myself, try to instruct me.
I shall do nothing of the sort, if you please. You play your role, and I'll play mine. Mine is to listen.
How nice and pleasing your manners are. Don't consult your senses and don't base your judgments on their testimony. Sound is indeed entirely different from moving air. But just for this reason, you have no ground for saying that sound is spread out in the air. For note this, all I can do by touching this string is to make it move, and in moving, all it can do is to disturb the air that surrounds it. When we look for the reason for certain effects, and tracing back from effects to causes, and to the causes of those, and so on, we finally reach a general cause, or a cause that we see has no intelligible relation to the effect that it produces, or rather, seems to produce. At that point, rather than imagining chimeras, we should bring in God, the author of the laws of nature. But the appeal to God should be postponed as long as possible. For example, if you asked me for the cause of the pain we feel when we are pricked, it would be wrong for me to answer straight off that prick followed by pain is one of the laws of the author of nature. I ought instead to tell you that a prick can't separate the fibers of my flesh without moving the nerves leading to the brain, and in that way, moving the brain itself. But if you wanted to know why, when a part of my brain is stirred up in a certain way, I feel the pain of a prick, since this question concerns a general effect and we can't work our way further back to a particular or natural cause, then we have to bring in God, the general cause. For your question amounts to asking about the authorship of the general laws of the union of body and soul. Since you see clearly that there can't be any necessary relation or connection between movements in the brain and sensations in the soul, we obviously have to bring in a power that isn't to be found in either the brain or the soul. Some philosophers say this: the soul causes its own pain. Pain is just the sadness the soul has because of a disorder that occurs in the body it loves, a disorder that it knows about through some difficulty it is having in the exercise of its functions. But to say this is to fail to attend to our own sense of what takes place in ourselves.
A few words on the subject, please. I want very much to meditate on the matter. My mind now is all ready for it.
There is no transformation. Motion in the brain can't be changed into light or color, since states of bodies are simply the bodies themselves in some particular condition. They can't be transformed into states of minds. That's obvious. There is no necessary relation between the two substances that make us up. States of our bodies can't, through their own efficacy, change states of our minds. Nonetheless, states of a certain part of the brain, never mind which, are always followed by sensations, states of our souls. And this happens entirely through the invariably operative laws of the union of these two substances, or to put it more openly, through the constant and invariably operative acts of the will of God, the author of our being. There is no relation of causality running from body to mind, or come to that, from mind to body. I go further. There is no such relation from a body to a body, or from a mind to another mind. In short, no created thing can act on any other by an efficacy of its own.
Would you believe it, Theodore? I'm delighted by what you tell me. To be sure, Theodore, it is God who has united my mind to my body. But couldn't it be said
What? That your mind is acting on your body right now and your body on your mind? I understand you. You want to say God made this union of mind and body. But then, with that union established, your body can act on your mind, and through it, so can everything else. And with that same union established, your mind can act in your body, and through it, on things in your environment. Isn't that what could be said?
there is something about it that I don't understand too well? How does it all take place? I ask this as someone who's forgotten the better part of what you've told me because I didn't think about it.
I doubt that. What you really want is for me to prove more rigorously and in greater detail the principles of which I have spoken to you thus far. Do you think, Aristes, that matter, which you judge perhaps not to be capable of moving itself or putting itself into any state, can ever affect the state of a mind? Make it happy or unhappy? Represent ideas to it? Give it different sensations? Think about this and answer me.
That seems to me to be impossible.
I repeat, think about it. If anything represents bodies, it is the idea of extension. Consult it to judge whether bodies can have any property other than the passive capacity to be given various shapes and various motions. Isn't it utterly evident that properties of extension can only consist in spatial relations?
Well, that is clear, and I've already agreed to it.
It follows that bodies can't possibly act on minds.
Not of themselves, not by their own force, so it will be said, but why can't they do so by a power resulting from the union with minds?
What? By a power resulting from their union? I can't find any meaning in these general terms. Remember the principle of clear ideas, Aristes. If you abandon that, then you'll be in darkness, and a single step will tumble you into a crevice. I do understand how bodies, in consequence of certain natural laws, can act on our minds in this sense. The states of bodies bring into play the efficacy of divine volitions, i.e., the general laws of the union of soul and body. States which always correspond to each other by seeming cause and effect are occasion for God's making the seeming cause to correspond to a seeming effect. And this is so wherever a cause and effect are perceived, whether this occasioned relation be by our body to our mind to our body, or any body to some other body. But I don't understand how bodies could be given a power, one that is really theirs, through the efficacy of which they could act in our minds. What power would that be?
It will be said that we don't know what that power is. But what can you conclude from an admission of ignorance on our part?
That it is better to keep quiet than try to say things that one doesn't know to be true.
Agreed.
We exist. This is an established fact. God is infinitely perfect. Hence, we depend on him. We don't exist against his will. We exist only because he wills that we exist. But how can God will that we exist when he has no need of us? A being who lacks nothing, a being who is fully self-sufficient. How can such a being will or want something? This is what gives rise to the difficulty.
It seems to me easy to remove the difficulty. We need only say that God created the world not for himself, but for us.
But what about us? For whom did he create us?
For himself.
Then the difficulty is back, for God has no need of us.
Well, let us say then, Theodore, that God made us from sheer goodness, from sheer love for us.
Let us not say that, Aristes, at least without explanation. For it appears evident to me that the infinitely perfect being loves himself infinitely, loves himself necessarily, that his will is simply the love he has for himself and his divine perfections, that his love cannot be moved from outside him, as ours is from outside us, and that therefore his love cannot lead him to anything outside himself. Because he is the sole cause of what he does, he must also be its end, what it aims at. Welcome to the post-dialogue discussion on Nicolas Malebranche, in which we connect some of his ideas to other theologians and philosophers of his day. As we mentioned, Malebranche got some mileage out of the Cartesian idea of continuous creation, which can be compared in some respects to his occasionalism. It suggests that because of the unity of created being, movement as we experience it is really just God's creating us again in a different observable relation to other objects. And yet, despite leaving no necessary place for matter as such in his system, saying, like Hume, that there was no rational case to be made for matter as an emanation from God, Malebranche was still reluctant to dismiss the possibility of a material or corporeal plane altogether, and this opened him up to criticisms. The German philosopher and logician Gottfried Leibniz, who died only 1 year later than Malebranche, would occasionally offer commentaries on him. Readers of Voltaire's Candide may know Leibniz's theories of sufficient reason for all happenstance and of ours being the best possible world brought about by God. Voltaire ruthlessly parodied this optimism with his character Dr. Pangloss. But Leibniz's theories nonetheless deserve to be taken seriously in the context of attempts to make sense of the world given Christian assumptions, for which Voltaire would also have few sympathies. Leibniz's monadology veers into separate territory from Malebranche, but a couple of their ideas were complementary. Malebranche maintained that extension was the one feature essential to matter, and this assumption of material extensibility was echoed in Leibniz's phrase natura non facit saltus, or nature does not make jumps. Were I to go up and retrieve my water glass, for example, you would of course see a completely fluid motion. Malebranche's equivocal stance on material substance, seeming to accuse it of superfluity without dispensing with it outright, was likely due to a desire to avoid comparisons with the pantheism of Baruch Spinoza, the idea of material creation by, rather than necessary emanation from God, helped him keep Spinoza's ideas at arm's length, something to which Leibniz's views might have again contributed by Leibniz's suggestion that a worship of creation was by extension praise given to its author. This runs into inconsistencies when applied rigidly to Malebranche, though, who was inconsistent on this point. After all, if there is an actual creation of interconnected bodies rather than mere perception of the same, his occasionalism, while not entirely disproved, seems very roundabout indeed. We should, before saying goodbye to him for now, give Leibniz his due for attempting to construct a universal logical language that would survive any theological trends. He contributed to a wide range of subjects, and our treatment of him here is necessarily very incomplete. But Malebranche's suspicion that our perceptions and the world we perceive are not substantial in themselves without the hand of God gives us a preview of next unit's George Berkeley and his idealism. Malebranche was also beset by the criticisms of his great rival, the logical theologian Antoine Arnaud. Antoine Arnaud was a perspicuous thorn in the side of the Cartesian circle, though sharing an emphasis on rationalism and a belief in a dualistic existence whereby the body and mind were subjected to different constraints. Arnaud advocated clear and precise logical thinking as the key to distinguishing between truth and falsehood, and espoused his system of doing so in his The Art of Thinking. The so-called Port Royal logic Arnaud advocated considered logic a mechanistic aid to argument and speech, but one that was itself not reflective of material universal laws, being a product of the spiritually unbound cognition, as it was. Thus, he rejected some of the precepts advocated by Leibniz, welcome back, and sometimes implicitly assumed by Malebranche. For example, the idea that reality can brook no contradiction, or the claim that any identical but identifiably separate objects must retain separate identities, for if they were actually identical, they would just be the same thing. These were not ideas Arnaud's Port Royal logicians thought could be taken for granted. Grammatical common sense of our lived experience tends to accept some of Leibniz's rules of logical reality, but quantum physics has thrown some wrenches in the works of our intuition, and while that field is not the source from which Arnaud would have expected or even appreciated the help, it nonetheless gives some credibility to his understanding of logic, if not to any positive conclusion of the divine.